Hello, committee. Thank you for your patience with moving around the Capitol complex. So we are gonna, until 11, we're gonna have a presentation from Pat that I think we might have mentioned on the very first day of this session with each other, which is really just like who are the Vermonters that we're talking about when we talk about taxes, really. And then we have the Education Committee joining us at 11 to talk to the administration some more, and then lunch, and then after lunch, we're back here in this same area, I guess. And with that, Pat, do you want to join us? Thank you.
I know you guys have been spending a lot of time in this room, but I feel like I'm playing an away game right now. But I'm Pat. I'm with the Joint Fiscal Office. I have some slides to show you today. There are quite a few of them, so I'm going to try and be efficient, but don't be afraid to tell me to slow down if you have a question. Yeah, so what I'm going to share today is in part sort of a brief on an issue brief that Joyce Manchester wrote about Vermont's population and how it's changed, kind of focused on the post-pandemic years. And then we'll also look at some income data, just looking at, across the age spectrum in the state. We're going to be talking a lot about age today. Across the age spectrum in the state, what type of earnings are people having at certain stages of their life? And then after that, we'll look at sort of a really quick look at what this year's basic needs budget report is saying is sort of what you need to afford, what you need to live in the state. And then at the end, if we have time, there's some considerations that were included in the issue brief, sort of for you all to keep in mind when you're talking about tax policy and how that applies to Vermont's sort of unique demographic structure. So as I mentioned, this is sort of the second iteration of an issue brief that will probably become somewhat regular given how important this topic is to the state. So last one was written in 22. This year's version last year's version was written last year. The latest available data was for 2022. This year, the latest we have available from the Census Bureau is 2023. And as I said, it's always been a topic of conversation, gotten much more important since the pandemic. That link there will bring you to this year's issue brief if you want to read that in more depth. So some highlights from the most recent edition. So in 2021, sort of right around when the pandemic was at its peak and people were moving around, I use the term the Vermont's population swelled by 4,100 people. And I think that's actually an appropriate term because if you look at the 2 years after that, there's only a net change of 17 people in 22 and under 400 in 2023. Now, I think I have this number a little bit later on in 2024, which Tom referenced when he was talking to you about the consensus forecast, I believe. There's actually a decrease of around, I think, 200 people in 2024. And that's a bit of an anomaly. It's the first time Vermont's population has decreased in a really long time. But, I think what's interesting right after that is 2021, you heard all the stories of people buying houses sight unseen. I moved back to Vermont in 2021 because I was living in a city and it was not fun to live in cities around then. Just a lot of people were sort of moving here because there's a lot more outdoor amenities where you can actually go and do something during the day. So yeah, as of 23, there's a little under 650,000 people in the state. And then from that period of 2020 and 2023, there are a few age groups that saw sort of the biggest changes over that time. So, right off the bat, we've got about 4,000 fewer children ages 0 to 17 in the state. A lot of that is due to declining birth rates, which have still not come back to pre-pandemic levels. But, in the 25 to 39 age cohort, I'm one of these 2,000. You saw an increase of about 2,000. So those sort of early career professionals who, found Vermont to be an attractive state, given the fact that we have such low birth rates and so few children, it's likely that a lot of these people are immigrants from elsewhere, just because, you have the lower age cohort aging into it, but there's not that many of them compared to a lot of other states in Vermont. There's in that time period, about 6,100 fewer people ages 55 to 64. This is a important demographic for two reasons. They're later career individuals, so they tend to have higher incomes than lower, like younger Vermonters. But also, this is the age group that's sort of graduating into like retirement age, when maybe they're selling their business, they're not having the same type of income they had before, which has tax implications. And then the biggest swing, more than 10%, was that 65 to 79 group. So I mentioned that big decrease in that 55 to 64 group. Conversely, we have a big increase in that 65 to 79 group. So those people just entering retirement age. And then, so the absolute number is not quite as big, but people over the age of 80, that's about a 10% increase. That was 2,600 more people over that 3-year time period.
Yeah.
So just so I understand these numbers, so the bottom one, the 2,600 people over 80, and the next one up, the 65 to 79, the 10,000 people, is that simply a demographic, the bubble, baby boomers?
Yeah, so
Okay.
we've got some commentary on that in a couple of slides, so
All right,
that'll
I'll
tee
wait
that up
then.
perfectly. But there's also
Sure.
a table coming up that'll show you, this is not all of the age brackets, but I'll have one that shows you every age bracket and talk
Okay.
about that a little bit.
I'll wait then, thank you.
So just to sort of highlight, demographics impact a lot of sort of your work and just everyday aspects of Vermont life. Excuse me. So employment. So if we look at the working age population, generally between the ages of 25 and 64, in 2020, that accounted for 51.3% of our state's total population. And just 3 years later, that was down about 1% to 50.4. And I know like 1% doesn't always sound like a lot, but in a 3-year period, a demographic shift like that, where the working age share of total population has decreased by that amount, is something to sort of pay attention to. The reason for which is on both ends of the age spectrum, you need that working age population to be there to fill employment roles for healthcare services and other services that the elderly require as they shift into consuming more services than goods later in life. And also on the other end, you need those people available to open up those childcare slots that we've been so coveting, right? It's important to have sort of a healthy share of working age to those two populations that require more services and people to be employed in those industries. So that's just something to pay attention to. And also it affects tax collections as well. So like I said, income often shifts depending on your age, with younger people relying more on wages, while older Vermonters receive a higher share of their income from things like Social Security, retirement plans, and things like that, which are taxed differently than your wages. There's some large exemptions on that type of income for certain Vermonters, on Social Security, for example, that can reduce the amount of tax that they are liable for compared to when all their income was coming from their wages. And then, like I said, just it's the care for having the employees available for care for both the young and the elderly is an important thing to think about. So just a little further, during the pandemic, Vermont saw an influx of young and middle-aged adults, which I think kind of goes a little against some of the narratives we hear sometimes that, all people like me are just moving out of the state in droves. But actually during the pandemic, we saw a lot of those working young and middle-aged adults come in. However, that number was
Is that because the kids came and moved back into the basement and attic or what?
I don't live in my parents' basement. I can't speak for everyone.
And, you know, I mean, there's the basement and attic that's like, someone's really struggling to make it and it's sort of a bad time for the economy. And then there's the fact that like, I don't know about you, my house is a little too big for me now, right? And so like, maybe it's actually just us using our housing stock efficiently, I don't know.
Yeah, one other thing I'd also just.
I just do know that a lot
Yeah.
of kids have moved back into their parents for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and the other thing I was just throw out there is, you know, if you're low income, like moving can be a really sort of a burdensome expense. You that can't necessarily always afford it. So there are the situations where you have to do something like that, move in with someone you know, or you have to be you know, sort of middle or higher income and you can afford, you know, that security deposit, first, last month rent, the moving truck, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so we saw the influx of young and middle-aged adults during the pandemic, but that increase was outnumbered by the decline in adults ages 55 to 64. So that can be sort of two categories. That's sort of people aging, existing Vermonters aging into that, or aging out of that age range. But it also could be, you know, some migration effects. So there's always those two pieces to think about when you're talking about changes in the age cohorts in Vermont. So yeah, like I said, birth rates have dropped pretty sharply during the pandemic, and they still remain below pre-pandemic levels. And then, yeah, like I said earlier, Vermont's population fell by about 200 people as in 2024 compared to 23 in preliminary estimates.
Do you have a graph? And I remember Tom and Jeff like went deep in their nerdy little world for a minute at eBoard about that. And what I gathered from it is they think that number will actually go away in a couple of years. And it was just like
yeah, so
flip. But I'm wondering is there a graph coming up that shows that drop of 215 relative to the growth 2 years ago?
I haven't made a chart for the 2024 number.
Okay.
However, to Tom and Jeff's point, the number right now is so preliminary that they haven't released any of the age cohort information. It's just sort of the raw estimated migration and total population figure. So yeah, I think it's going to get revised, like as they always do. I was looking at the margins of error are pretty significant on it.
And I think I'm wondering if the drop of 215 is if we're still if we're still growing. It was just sort of like we're not still growing, but we're still well above where we were, say, 5 years ago in terms of our population.
Yeah,
That's what I'm trying to understand.
So I wish I'd pulled like the 2028 specific figure, but actually maybe it is included. Where's that table that we
They
have?
can wait. It's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, in the 3 years since COVID, you can see that we've added 4,100 people there.
Okay, thank you.
So longer term trend, I think 10 years ago, we probably had about 630,000 Vermonters. And so it has been sort of steadily growing over time. So we talked about, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Were we right here? Yeah. Okay, cool. So baby boomers are defined as those born between 1946 and 1964, and they were ages 56 to 74 in 2020. And so you can see that big bubble, and there'll be a chart kind of illustrating this bubble. That bubble has still been moving through the system and entering those post like traditional working years. And there's still a big part of that cohort still to come to go through that transition. So I think you can look at the chart and you'll see that, the share of the retired Vermonters is expected to continue growing at a pretty rapid pace in the near future. And like I said, that group, almost 1,100 or 11,000 more individuals, which is more than 10%, which is interesting because that was more than double the overall growth in the state population over that same time periods, suggesting that other age cohorts are going down. So the biggest decline by any age group was that, like the Gen X young baby boomer, population, that's the 55 to 64 cohort, which decreased by 6,100. What's significant about that is, like I was talking about before, that is your sort of prime earning years. That's when we typically see Vermonters having their highest income. So that has implications on state revenues going forward. Because as they age out of that group and the group coming in behind them is smaller, you know, that could put some downward pressure, absent any like overall state population growth to make up for the difference. So, you know, it's just another thing to look in the long-term trend. Maybe beyond the, I think Tom and Jeff have a 5-year look. It might even be a slightly longer look ahead than that. And then the young and middle-aged Vermonters, this is actually a group where we did see some increases. It's about 2,000, not enough to offset the decrease in the sort of later career Vermonters, but it was about 2%. Many of these people are likely, not all, but many of them are likely immigrants from elsewhere. The rationale for that being the cohort of children coming behind them is quite small and likely not enough to explain the overall increase, because again, you've got people in that cohort both aging out, but also maybe sometimes moving out now. And then sort of the thinking is the immigrants are probably making up the difference there. Largely probably because a lot of them were working remotely and maybe still are able to work remotely during the pandemic. And they've decided once they moved here that they didn't want to leave. And just based on the age range of these individuals, you might assume that they'd be moving here with young families. The data overall suggests that that might be not as prevalent as you might think, mostly because of the drop in the number of children in the state. So both, you know, those preschool age kids dropped by almost 6%, and then school age kids fell by almost 3.5%. So sort of decreases across the board for Vermont's like 0 to 17 children. So this is the chart I was talking about with that bulge. If you look at it, the blue line there refers to the single year of age in 2020, and then green would be 2023. Two things I want to give special attention to. Can you see my cursor? Mm-hmm. This right here, so this blue bulge here for 2020, those are the baby boomers sort of aging from their sort of prime earning years into retirement age. And you can see that we've really just started to hit the tip or the very like peak of that bulge here. So again, sort of a lot of people rapidly aging out of sort of the traditional working age of Vermont. The other big spike here.
Hey, Pat,
Sorry.
just a question, because, I mean, if there was no migration, you would have 2023 just a later mirror of 2020, right?
I'm sorry. my
So we have a
computer's-
weird thing.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, but we're good.
Teams just took over my screen.
Okay.
It looks like it didn't affect that though. Sorry, could you ask the question again? Like it was having a
I have two
connection.
questions. One, this doesn't really show a trend so much as a bar graph would be even more represent. Ah, there we go. Oh. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. But the line graph does show some relationship as that baby boomer cohort gets older.
Mhm.
So especially in that 55 to 64, where that green line is just 3 years later. Not interesting.
Well, and the only other thing on this chart, so this was kind of the main point. You probably did notice this big spike there. It's that 18 to 21 population. We bring in a lot of students who don't necessarily stick around. But yeah, that's why you'd see that big spike there, because, you know, UVM, the Vermont State schools and whatnot. So yeah, this chart, this is showing sort of share of total population for each cohort. Again, as you're on the left side of this graph, kind of consistently, the share of total population has been going down each year. And it's not until you get into these sort of retired older populations that you do see those sort of big increases ramping up as the state is sort of rapidly aging. So again, another thing to look at sort of going forward, especially as that bulge really sort of passes over that line from traditional working years to retirement age, and just the tax implications for the state that could have on revenues. So I think I've touched on this a little bit, but there's sort of two key aspects of population change. There's the migration aspect, and then there's just natural population, which is just births and deaths. So since 2021, Vermont has experienced more domestic in-migration than out-migration, meaning that, I mean, it's probably self-explanatory. More people move to Vermont from other US states than move from Vermont to other US states. And then from 22 to 23, almost 850 more residents moved into Vermont than other states then left. So going back even further, that change is even more significant. It's about 6,700. So there are a lot of people moving from other states to Vermont, and so much so that we're actually attracting more people than have been leaving. Now, granted, this is during the pandemic era, so there is likely some pandemic refugees coming our way, so to speak. But domestic has not been the only thing that's been sort of help pushing Vermont's population up. We also have a reasonable amount of international in-migration. From 22 to 23, we netted more than 1,300 new Vermonters. And when you put both domestic and international migrants together, they netted over almost 2,200 Vermonters since 2022. And like I said, that's not the whole story. We have the natural population change.
Sorry, Pat, on the international immigration, does that count like refugees who were placed in Vermont, or is that just people moving, like choosing to move?
It would be both.
Both.
Do you happen to know if we still, at some point, we had the highest per capita refugee resettlement in the country? Do you know if that's still true?
I don't know if that's still true, but that's an interesting question. I would be surprised if it's changed. Yeah.
On the answer, I don't know.
And I do have a chart right after this that sort of shows these two pieces put together,
Oh.
but not the per capita thing, but so yeah, between 22 and 23, Vermont births to Vermont residents were about 5,100, while the number of deaths was more like 6,900. So the net population loss there, just through natural population change, was about 1,800 Vermonters. So you can see there that if we just looked at natural population change and took out migration altogether, we're actually shrinking. It's really those in-migrants that are helping us continue to grow. Yeah, so this is a chart, kind of putting those two pieces together from the Census Bureau. And so actually, I guess to kind of come back to your question about whether that includes refugees or not, the Census Bureau still does not include the question on citizenship. So kind of it still goes out to every single household regardless of status. So it should be capturing that whole population. And whether you're, undocumented citizen, refugee, some other kind of visa holders, the whole point is to capture the entire population of the country rather than just, the citizen population. Yeah, so from 22 to 23, you can see that number we talked about earlier. Pretty meager growth, about 354 Vermonters. Natural change was negative, but it was offset by a higher degree of migration, both international and domestic. Going back a little bit further, almost 4,400, 4,400 higher, more Vermonters. When you look at that, the natural population change looks even more stark, almost 5,200 fewer Vermonters just through the natural change. Now, that is also capturing COVID times when deaths were likely elevated and birth rates we actually saw were particularly lower. But again, we still saw a lot of immigration, both international, but you can see that that domestic number really spikes up. Again, a lot of people coming here to get away from, cities or wherever they were that they, weren't happy with during the pandemic. And again, so this is based on those super preliminary numbers for 2024, but I just wanted to show you how those numbers might change a little with the 24 figures. So just the 1 year, again, it's a slight decrease and very preliminary, but going back to 2020, it's still fairly robust growth. Or I don't know, 5,400 is necessarily robust, but it's solid growth over that time period. Including, the COVID era. So that is sort of what was included in the issue brief. What I'm going to pivot to next is very chart heavy. It's really just to illustrate some of the points I was making about how, some of those later career individuals are in their peak earning years and how that just is distributed amongst them. So like, household income tends to vary by age in Vermont and nationally. Typically households with where the primary householder. So when I use primary householder, with the way that's sort of defined is just going to be who's like. So like it could be let's say someone in their 50s who is taking care of their parents who also live in the house. They would be considered the primary householder in that situation. But if it was a grandparent with their grandkid was staying with them, and the grandparents, it's sort of like the head of household, or maybe the one who's claiming the dependence on the tax return kind of deal. Typically households where the primary householder is between the ages of 45 and 64 have the highest income. 52% of Vermont households with income over 200,000, which is sort of the top cutoff point in this data set, are headed by someone between the ages of 45 and 64. So amongst the highest earning households, over half of them are in that age range. And then younger and older Vermonters disproportionately make up that age group that are making less than 25,000. You can see it's almost a third that are under 25. Now that does include some like college age kids. I guess I should say college age adults if they're over 17, over 18. And then, 1 in 5 households over the age of 65 are reporting an income of less than 25,000.
I think one thing that's interesting about this that we don't often get to see mapped, and might be part of that sort of summer endless overlay project that we were talking about, is that sort of highest earning period is also a period when a lot of people still are paying their mortgages, right? And so it's interesting to see how that overlaps with people's expenses. And are often paying health insurance out of pocket as well, right? Or healthcare out of pocket. Yeah.
So I was wondering about this refers to income, not assets.
This is purely income.
Income that they claim on a tax return. So it's not money that's in the stock market or money that's in an IRA somewhere. It's only on what they claim on a tax return. That makes a big difference with how well people live.
Well, I just want to make one slight clarification. So this is sort of Census Bureau reported income. So this is going to be a little bit different than the tax department's reported income. So like this could include like Roth IRA distributions, which are not taxable, right? Just as an example, but when I say 25,000, this is for like pre any like exemptions or deductions. So it's not saying they have $25,000 of income that is liable for taxation. Because of course they'll have their standard deduction, personal exemptions. They'll have the Social Security exemption, which could bring that liability all the way down to zero, right? But the income would include, to your point, it would include distributions from some of those retirement accounts, right? But it wouldn't necessarily include the value of that account.
Just thinking, we are Ways and Means, the meanies. I'm trying to figure out what is available, the meanies, yeah. What is available to us to tax? So it's for us to tax would be easy on the tax return, but digging into what someone has from a distribution account would be harder. Probably we can't even get at that information.
So that's a great segue for some light reading. I might encourage you. Joyce also wrote a issue brief on wealth in the state of Vermont, which tries to get at some of those questions. Kind of the spoiler alert is there's really not good data available for that question at the state level. But it might be of interest for some of those questions.
And other spoiler alert on the report, one piece that stood out to me was that wealth and income are not as correlated as people think they are. And so that was sort of another fun takeaway from the report. It's a quite short report compared to the other reports that everyone's been told about. It's really a few pages long, and there are a lot of charts and graphs. What?
Social will send it.
Mhm.
Great. Thank you.
And are we doing okay on time?
We have 22 minutes.
That should be fine.
Okay.
So this is just looking at the income. This is the less interesting bar chart. This is just total population, looking at the number of people in each income bucket. You can see, generally speaking, more people on this side of the graph, at the lower income side, than on this side of the graph. But when you break it up by age cohort, you'll see some more distinct patterns there. So this might be slightly hard to look at, but the reason being it's not scaled for like share of population, it's just raw counts. So if you're looking at these blue bars, those are under 25. You can see that their highest bar is at this lowest income spectrum, and they just gradually decrease as they go along the income spectrum until they get to these 77, 148 people in these two highest income groups. Sort of a very inverse relationship. You look at the 25 to 44 years, sort of generally, these are the purple bars, or sorry, not purple, orange. I'm not colorblind, I promise.
So if you are.
I know. They are sort of, as you go up the income spectrum until about this 150 range, more people, they're taking up a bigger share of their population in those groups, until again, sort of petering out. The gray bars, which are sort of this cohort that we've been talking the most about, these are the later career Vermonters that, are sort of aging out of their highest years. They make up by far the biggest majority of these high income earners, both in this 200 plus and the 150 plus. So you can see that while they might not be as big of a cohort, like overall, as some of the others, they're really concentrated on this far right side of the graph compared to the other age groups. And then again, so the yellow bars are the over 65. You see a lot of them coming in these lower income groups down here, earning less than 50,000, a large portion of them. And so this is looking at it a little different way. So this is showing in each income bucket what percentage is of each age cohort. So if you're looking at this first bar here in the 0 to 25,000, that means that 7% of people earning that amount are under 25, 17% are earning, are between the ages of 25 and 44, 30 is the 45 to 64, and then 46, the over 65. So the biggest cohort in this under 25 group are those people over the ages of 65. And again, you move along the income spectrum, you see that people earning basically above 150,000, those households make up about 50 or more than 50% of those income groups. And again, in terms of earnings, that 45 to 64 group is very important in terms of total income in the state. And this is looking at it just at the age group level. These charts should just show you, I had another bar chart, but it was really ugly, so I wanted pie charts. I don't usually like pie charts, but yeah, you can see again for the under 25, almost a third of them are earning that under 25,000. I have them juxtaposed over here with the oldest group in the what was in the data set, the over 65. And again, you see that 1 in 5 of them are earning less than 25. And if you go up to 50,000, it's almost half are earning less than 50,000 a year. Very small, or so slightly larger in the over 65, 6%, and then 7% are earning over 150 and then 200,000. But for those under 25s, hardly any are in that sort of top earning group. Looking at the two middle groups put together, again, we have sort of the peak earning years cohort here, the 45 to 64. When you look at it this way, it looks like a much more sort of even split than when we were looking at it compared to the other income groups, age groups. But again, you can see the highest percentage of any of the income groups is that that dark wedge here is 16% makes up the plurality, I guess you'd say, of this age cohort. And then again, with the 150 plus, put those two together, that's about a third of people in that age cohort are earning above 150,000. And then, yeah, sort of looking at like the young professionals age, they're sort of wedged right here. Their biggest wedge is sort of in that middle income group. That's 100 to 150. And again, this is household income. It's not just individuals. So just keep that in mind when I say something like middle income. Yeah, but again, sort of more evenly distributed. They're in all different stages of their careers, this group. And yeah, so more evenly distributed overall. So those were sort of the Census Bureau looks that I pulled. There is one other section here that I want to talk about, and that's looking at tracking wages over time in Vermont. And some of it has to do with the recently published basic needs budget. Just to give you like a really quick big picture on the basic needs budget, because we don't have time to like really go through it.
And if folks want us to at another time, we can. Just
Yeah.
wanted to give a teaser now because we don't always go deep into it, and some years we do, some years we don't.
So yeah, the purpose is to calculate the cost to afford a household basic needs in Vermont and the wage required to afford those needs without public assistance. And that's kind of a key point there. So the report's not meant to be a mandate. It's sort of an informative tool. I know some employers will use it sort of as a benchmark to how are we comparing to, what the basic needs budget is saying if people need to earn to afford their basic needs. But again, it's not statutorily used for setting any wage levels or, benefits thresholds or anything like that. So this is, and quick context, we calculate these budgets for both urban and rural areas. So this first look here is comparing the 22 report with the 24 report. You'll notice in this right column here, some pretty significant swings. There was really high inflation during this period, which is accounting for a lot of that, including in particular, housing costs. So those are some very big contributors there, but what might seem kind of odd when you look at it is you see for these households with children, excluding the one where there's one wage earner, like a 2-adult household with one wage earner, you're actually seeing some decreases. And there's a very important reason for that I would allow someone to try and guess.
Child tax credit. Child tax credit?
That's part of it, but it's not the most significant piece of it.
Child care cost.
Child care subsidies, exactly. So some might say, well, wait, you just said that this doesn't include public assistance, right? There was a technical advisory committee that reviewed this and sort of determined, well, this is really more of a public good. The reason for that being the eligibility for these subsidies is at 575% of the federal poverty line. And all of these budgets are well below that level. So it's sort of a cognitive dissonance to not include that in the calculations, but by removing that really high cost budget that had been in previous reports and just replacing that with their family share that they have to contribute, you actually saw here, so a single person with 2 children, from 22 to 24, we're calculating a 6.2% decrease in their livable wage, which is pretty significant when you look at some of those other categories, like at just a single person, almost a 20% increase, a lot of that owing to a lot of inflation and other, important costs that have sort of actually front run sort of the nationally reported inflation metrics. So that's the urban. We also calculate these budgets for rural. Again, you see the same sort of relationship for the households without children, high single to low double digit percent increases. And then for those households with kids, decreases. And I just wanted to show you what this has looked like over time. Interestingly, so in blue, you have the basic needs budget or the livable wage. And in orange, you have the Vermont minimum wage. And it's not perfect, but generally they have been tracking on the same sort of trajectory, except separated, right? So there's been kind of consistently if you look down here, about a $4 gap between the two. And then you move back up here, still about a $4 gap between the two. But because the basic needs budget incorporates inflation, right? And the minimum wage has largely been adjusted for inflation over time. I know that calculation changed slightly a few years ago to try and catch up to $15 an hour. They've largely been sort of tracking with inflation and sort of keeping up on the same trajectory. And then there's that stinky federal minimum wage line right here, which is unchanged going back beyond the scope of this chart. I think in our region, New Hampshire is the only state that still uses this. There's a handful of other states nationwide, but almost every state has their own minimum wage set above that amount. Here, I just pulled a graph up the Federal Reserve's website, again, showing what median household income has looked like in the state over time. During the dot-com bubble, you're still seeing some median household income increases. Wasn't really until that 2007 range, right before the Great Recession, that you saw some decreases, and then coming out of it. But, overall, in the last 24 years, Vermont median household incomes have been sort of on a not smooth, but steady trajectory upwards. Right now, the statewide median income, it looks like, is about $85,000, whereas back in 2000, about 40,000. Now, of course, that's not adjusted for inflation, but just thought it was an interesting chart to pull this morning. And this is sort of comparing those different income amounts based on what metric you're looking at. So this is for a single adult with one child. The wage comparison there is, if you look at federal poverty level, it's 20,000. So the federal poverty, if you're below 20,000 with a child, they're saying that's when you hit poverty. At the Vermont minimum wage, you'd be at about just a hair under 30,000. And you can see that there's that gap there, it really gets exacerbated between the two when you compare the basic needs budget, for in an urban area what is that? $45,000 difference, and then about a $30,000 difference for a rural area. And then, Vermont median income just showing you for this size household, you see this median income relates to a 2-person household. That's above everything here. So when we talk about the basic needs budget, looking at a chart like this, I think it can kind of show you that we're still not talking about like your median income household. They'd still be coming in on sort of the lower end of the income spectrum, even though we're still well above the state minimum wage levels.
If I could just point, this is a personal issue for me. I worked on the 15 an hour bill back in 2018 that did not pass. And when you look at tracking the living wage from the 2010 to 24 chart, it's keeping up, with inflation to a point, but the gap between the living wage and the minimum wage is about $1 more so than it was in 2022. So I would say we're losing ground there. And I always hate using the federal poverty level as a measure for I'm just on my soapbox now, but using the federal poverty level as a measure for anything is just, anyone who thinks you can live a real dignified life on $20,000, even $28,000 in 2025, it's not right. I think we have a lot of work to do to boost those wages. And then you go back and look at the pie charts of folks who are older and folks who are younger, making less than $25,000 a year when our full-time at Vermont minimum wage is $28,000. Something is just not working for young folks and young families in Vermont.
Just a clarification, this last one, the Vermont median family income, says 2 persons. And yet you've got a single adult and 1 child. Are we assuming 2 working persons?
So
or
that's
just-
kind of an eagle eye. I've kind of been annoyed with this chart in the
Oh.
past. But it's been included in the report for as longer than I've been at JFO. I think a better one to look at might be this one. It's 2 slides ahead.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
4-person household where you have 2 adults and 2 kids. So that would probably be a better comparison between the 3 budgets.
Okay.
It's a
Yeah.
good eye. You've caught on to a pet peeve of mine.
Well,
And
Peeve of mine
folks who are
too.
starting to join the room, we're gonna switch gears and have the education committee join us in 5 minutes.
So this chart is really just another pie chart showing you how, when you put the different spending categories in the basic need budget together, sort of what share of overall, the overall budget it takes up. For the 2 adults household, housing and transportation make up a big chunk. But I just want to jump back 2 slides. You can see when we're at the single adult with 1 child household, that housing chunk is way bigger. It goes from 14% of the household budget to 25% for the single household budget, just kind of showing you the importance of that expense for those type of households. It's taking a bit much larger bite out of the household budget. The last thing on here is just some considerations that are in the issue brief. The first is just looking at, is Vermont's aging situation different than the United States overall? And there's a few points here that I think could be good reference for you. As things come up, kind of think about, does Vermont's demographic, people always say, well, this other state's doing that, this other state's doing this. Is that really a good fit for us compared to them? Because we need to sort of think about what the differences in populations looks like. Again, this chart is just kind of comparing where those age groups compare to nationally. You see much lower share of our state's population is the 0 to 17 population compared to nationally. But then you get into those older age groups and you can see that the whole relationship flips. You've got a much higher share of those older Vermonters, and sort of thinking about what impact that has on all the policies you're thinking about. And I've talked about this a little bit throughout, but will the aging, the people in those peak earning years, those working age adults, as they're aging into their traditional retirement years, will that contribute to a slowing growth, both in state growth and also state revenue growth over time? Because again, you're moving out of those peak earning years into retirement. The whole tax picture changes when you reach retirement. And then the last thing, and then I should be done, is just some points that Joyce included in her report on things to think about when think about policy for how to adjust to and adapt the economy to Vermont's changing demographics. And I think with that, I see a lot of people filing in, so I'm pretty much done and we
Thank
can
you
wrap
so
up.
much. Thank you for joining us.
It's a mad
Folks,
dash.
if any piece of this, you want to hear more testimony on in the next month or so, just let me know and we'll get that done. Thank you so much, Pat.
Of course.
I think we can do all of us. Let's take a brief break.